A gunshot slices through the still Houston night. Asia, Gina Foster, just 22, lies motionless on East Greenwich. The distant glow of streetlights casting long shadows over her broken body. Her phone, still warm, has been ringing urgently, insistent calls from a man who would become her killer. On that night meant for remembrance, meant for love, for honoring lives lost, Asia's last words will never be heard. There is only silence. The community that knew her laughter, her kindness, her tireless work is left with one question. Why? Why would the very person she trusted so much, or perhaps didn't even know well, end her life in a moment of blind rage? Now rewind. On the evening of the 20th of November 2020, Houston is thick with reverence. It's the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Candles are lit. People gather in quiet vigils for those whose names have become echoes. Among them, Asia, bright-eyed, caring, hopeful, attends youth night at Montrose Grace Place. She hands out bus passes, listens to others, laughs, comforts. She leaves the center around 10 p.m., saying only that she's meeting someone. These are the last moments before her world shifts forever. Before the phone calls, the car, the betrayal, the irreversible. Asia Gina A. Foster was born in 1998. By 2020, she had become a rising light in Houston's Black transgender and LGBTQ+ community. Known for generosity, empathy, and a tireless willingness to support others, she wasn't just part of her community. She was one of its pillars. She helped young transgender folks, homeless youth, those on society's margins. When a fellow transgender woman, Tracy Single, was killed, Asia didn't flinch. She helped build a memorial, even crafting keepsakes by hand. Her friends saw in her not just activism but love in its rawest form, the kind that reaches with open hands. The 20th of November 2020 was one of those nights that seemed ordinary in its beauty and weight. America on that date marked the Transgender Day of Remembrance. In Houston, in Montrose Grace Place, Asia was there, carefully distributing bus passes, listening to tales of struggle, sharing smiles. She left the center around 10 p.m., under streetlights that made every shadow stretch long, with a sense of purpose, though none could have known how fragile the next hour would be. Her phone buzzed incessantly, an unknown number pressing her to come out, to meet. Friends heard the tone insistent but not menacing. Asia hesitated briefly, then stepped into a car that pulled up. What happened inside those few minutes is pieced together from fragments: surveillance, grainy, phone logs, post-mortem forensic work. They show that shortly after Asia got in, something snapped. The man calling her, identified later as Gerald Gurmel Richards, had been relentless. Some say text messages, others say spoken words on the phone. Perhaps promises. She trusted enough to sit in his car, but once inside, furious discovery followed. When Richards realized Asia was transgender, he claimed to have felt deceived. Pride, shame, rage collided. Words escalated into shouting. The atmosphere in that small vehicle turned tangibly dark. Around 30 minutes after she left Montrose Grace Place, Asia lay dead near 3400 East Greenwich Drive, a mile from where she had stepped into that car. There was no visible struggle at the scene, no shell casings, little blood. The life that had been vibrant was unrecognizable in death. The forensic team would later find foreign DNA enough to show possible assault and trace her final phone calls to Richards. Yet for hours, for days, the mystery of who Richards was, why Asia answered his insistent calls, how someone so committed to helping others ended up alone and vulnerable in a stranger's car, remained tangled. Investigators knocked on doors. They revisited surveillance cameras, though images were blurry. They interviewed friends who remembered Asia smiling, speaking of the meeting, but not fearing it. Her openness, once praised, now haunted. Was it trust or necessity that made her step out into danger? The calls that night came from a number registered under false information. Richards seemed invisible, unremarkable in record books, unknown in Asia's circles, but leaving trails that would not stay hidden forever. When forensic science finally delivered a match nearly 2 years later, it was Richards's DNA, the same number that had called her, and phone location data placing him where Asia's phone was traced. When confronted, his calm cracked. Denials turned to shuddering confession. He claimed that when he discovered Asia was transgender, he felt betrayed, as though she had tricked him, insulted him, and in that moment of rage, he killed her. The prejudice was raw, the hate immediate. Asia's family, friends, Houston's LGBTQ+ community, their grief had layers. 1. For the life lost. 2. For the trust broken. 3. For the realization that her vulnerability, her openness, her kindness had been used against her. And yet, they held on to something. Truth. The truth that science could not be ignored. The truth that her name would not be lost. A question still lingers in the dark. How did a woman so loved become so exposed? Where is the line between compassion and danger? And was anyone able to see it before that final journey? If this moves you, there's a lot more to this story that will leave you speechless. If you find it worth listening to, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. The first patrol car rolled quietly onto East Greenidge Drive that November night. Its headlights cut through the still air, sweeping over a scene that would haunt Houston for months. Just a mile from Montrose Grace Place, beneath the dim yellow glow of tired street lamps, lay the lifeless body of a young woman. Her face was still, her clothes intact, but something about the way she was left there, on the curb as if discarded, froze the officers in place. The man who called 911 could hardly form words. His voice cracked, trembling. "She's not moving. Please. Someone come quickly." The urgency in his tone was matched only by the weight of what he had stumbled upon. Officers knelt beside her, checked for signs of life. But it was already too late. The name would come later. But that night the body was catalogued as Jane Doe, her identity not yet confirmed. What they did know, even in those first minutes, was that this was no random death. The quiet street bore no marks of violence, no scattered casings, no pools of blood, no tire tracks etched into the asphalt. The silence suggested a chilling truth. This was not the place where the crime occurred. It was only a dumping ground. Someone had brought her here coldly, deliberately placing her under those lonely street lamps before disappearing into the night. Forensics soon joined the scene. Cameras flashed as evidence was documented. A young officer, barely a year into service, later admitted, "My first thought was that someone wanted us to find her. They didn't care about hiding her. It was like a statement." But what kind of statement? And from whom? Hours later, the morgue confirmed her name. Asia Gina A. Foster, 22 years old. a name that sent shockwaves through Houston's LGBTQ+ community. Asia wasn't a stranger. She was a leader. The community she had spent her short life uplifting now faced the unimaginable task of mourning her. Police immediately traced her steps back to Montrose Grace Place. Friends remembered her smile that night. They remembered her laughter, the way she pressed bus passes into open palms. A simple gesture of care. They remembered her saying she had a meeting before stepping out. Then the phone buzzing, vibrating non-stop. They remembered how she picked it up with a mix of hesitation and curiosity. And they remembered how she slipped into that waiting car, its make and license plate barely visible in the shadows. Who was on the other end of those calls? Detectives began piecing together the night with urgency. Surveillance cameras were checked around Montreux and East Greenwich. Some caught a glimpse of the vehicle, but the footage was grainy and the plate unreadable. The city's shadows seemed to conspire in protecting the killer. Investigators turned to Asia's phone. Her call logs revealed a disturbing pattern. Repeated calls from the same unfamiliar number in the hours before her death. Dozens of attempts, one after another, like a relentless drumbeat pulling her toward danger. But the number was a dead end. Registered under false information, untraceable to any real person. A ghost caller. Still, location data revealed something important. The calls originated in Houston, not far from where Asia was last seen. The killer was close, perhaps closer than anyone realized. The autopsy deepened the mystery. Asia's body bore the unmistakable signs of assault before the fatal gunshot. Forensic technicians carefully extracted DNA samples, preserving them in hopes of a match. At first, nothing appeared in CODIS, the national DNA database. No immediate hits. The killer had no prior record that would flag him. It was as if he had stepped out of nowhere, committed an unspeakable act, and vanished again. Weeks turned into months. The investigation dragged. Detectives chased tips, interviewed acquaintances, pulled at every thread they could find. Asia's wide network of friends and community connections made the task daunting. She knew so many people, trusted so freely, that narrowing suspects became like searching for one face in a crowd of hundreds. Meanwhile, her family and friends demanded answers. They held vigils, marched in her honor, pleaded with police not to let her name be forgotten. For them, Asia was not just a statistic. She was the friend who arranged funerals, who carried burdens that weren't her own, who lived authentically, even when the world wasn't ready to accept her. To lose her this way, discarded on the street, was a wound too deep to measure. As 2021 turned to 2022, hope for justice dimmed. Investigators privately worried the case might go cold, another name added to the long list of unsolved murders of Black transgender women. But then, a glimmer appeared. Advanced DNA analysis, unavailable at the time of Asia's death, was run again on the preserved evidence. This time, a match. The foreign DNA belonged to a man named Gerald Richards, 32 years old, living in Houston. Richards was not a known figure in Asia's life. Friends and family had never heard his name. His criminal history was minor, nothing violent, nothing that would immediately mark him as dangerous. On the surface, he looked like an ordinary man. But the DNA did not lie. It placed him at the center of the crime. Detectives closed in. They pulled phone records, confirming what they already suspected. The relentless calls to Asia's phone? They were his. The location data that followed her across the city that night? His phone traced the same route, Piece by piece, the puzzle began to take shape. When investigators finally confronted Richards, he sat calmly at first, insisting he didn't know her. He denied ever meeting her, denied any involvement. But then they laid the DNA evidence before him. "Your DNA was found on her body," the detective said flatly. The mask cracked. Sweat beaded on his forehead. His denials faltered. Still, what no one expected was the explanation he eventually gave. Richards claimed that when he realized Asia was transgender, he felt deceived, insulted, that his pride, his sense of manhood, had been betrayed. In that moment of rage, he pulled the trigger. For investigators, it was a chilling confession. The motive was not money, not revenge, not some long-standing feud. It was hate. Raw, unfiltered prejudice. A young woman's life ended because someone else could not accept her truth. And yet, even with his confession, one haunting question lingered. Why did Asia, a woman so perceptive, so careful in her compassion, choose to meet a man who seemed to exist only in shadows? Was it trust? Was it necessity? Or was it simply that she believed, as she always had, that people deserved a chance? There's so much more to discover about Richards, about the investigation, and about the community's fight for justice. And what happens next will shock you. If you don't want to miss it, be sure to pre-register for Part 2. The months after Asia's murder stretched into a blur for her loved ones. Grief was constant, but silence from investigators was louder. Families in mourning cling to updates, calls from detectives, press releases, even rumors. But for Asia's family, days turned into weeks, weeks into months, with little more than unanswered questions. Who had taken her life? Why hadn't the city, with all its resources, moved faster? It wasn't just her family who felt the void. Houston's transgender community was already reeling. 2020 had been one of the deadliest years on record for transgender Americans, particularly for Black transgender women. The annual Transgender Day of Remembrance wasn't just symbolic, it was a ledger of names, growing longer year after year. Asia's name was added almost immediately after her death. Yet behind that solemn inclusion was frustration. No arrests, no charges, no one to hold accountable. Forensic science eventually whispered truths where human witnesses could not. DNA samples collected from Asia's body and from the area near her abandoned belongings told a story of contact. It was not enough for an arrest at first, but it became a breadcrumb trail. The calls to her phone the night she died were relentless, made from a number registered under fake information. But investigators, patient and methodical, traced location data. The number pinged towers near Grace Place, then followed her route, then vanished at the same time her life ended. Behind the scenes, detectives were circling closer to a man named Gerald Germel Richards. He wasn't a name that meant anything to Asia's friends or family. He wasn't part of her social circle, not a known face in her community. That, in some ways, made the betrayal worse. It wasn't a story of a trusted friend turning cruel. It was about a stranger who forced his way into her final moments. Richards, in the meantime, lived as though nothing had happened. He continued on with his daily routines, carried himself as though the night of the 20th of November, 2020, was just another page in a forgotten week. This kind of duplicity, hiding a violent secret while mingling with ordinary life, was chilling. Asia's loved ones carried grief every day, while the man suspected of causing it breathed free air. For Asia's mother, the hardest part was not knowing. not being able to explain to herself, let alone to others, how a daughter so full of light could vanish into silence. Friends kept her memory alive by posting, organizing, lighting candles. But the question burned. Would her case end up unsolved, like so many transgender murders that fall through the cracks of justice? It wasn't until 2022 that investigators finally had enough to press forward. DNA analysis connected Richards definitively to Asia. The phone records solidified the timeline. Surveillance footage, grainy but damning, showed a car matching his near the scene. When police confronted him, the facade cracked. Richards admitted what happened. His words were cold. He said he felt tricked, deceived, when he discovered Asia was transgender. Instead of walking away, instead of letting anger fade, he turned to violence. He pulled the trigger. To him, it was a moment of rage. To Asia, it was the end of a life full of potential. What makes Asia's case so haunting is that it mirrors the fears of so many in her community. Transgender women, especially Black transgender women, often live at the intersection of vulnerability. Meeting someone new can be dangerous. Trust can be weaponized. And prejudice, when inflamed, can become deadly in seconds. As news of Richard's arrest broke, Asia's friends expressed relief but also fury. Relief that finally, her killer had a name. Fury that it had taken so long, that the man had lived freely for years, while her memory was carried like a wound. Her name had been spoken at vigils, painted on signs, remembered in songs, but justice had lagged behind. The trial that followed was not just about one man and one victim. It became a mirror held up to society. How many others had died in silence? How many cases had been closed prematurely, dismissed, forgotten? Asia's story was personal to her family, but symbolic to many others. During the hearings, the prosecution laid out Richards's movements. They showed the relentless calls to her phone. They mapped his car's path. They presented the DNA evidence. Piece by piece, the puzzle became whole. When Richards's own words were read, his claim of feeling deceived, his justification rooted in prejudice, the courtroom felt a chill. His statement wasn't just a confession, it was a declaration of hate. It revealed the danger that transgender women face not only from strangers, but from a society that sometimes validates violent reactions to their existence. Asia's mother sat through it all, holding her daughter's photo. Friends testified to her kindness, her activism, her dreams. They wanted the court to see her not as a statistic, but as a woman with plans, laughter, and love. The weight of the trial was heavy, but it brought one undeniable truth into the light. Asia's life mattered. Her story would not be silenced. Her killer could no longer hide in shadows. And yet, even as Richards's fate in court moved toward a verdict, a deeper question lingered. How many more names would be added to the list before something changed? Before lives like Asia's could be lived without fear? The courtroom was heavy with silence when the jury filed back in. Families of both the victim and the accused sat rigid, breaths shallow, waiting for the words that would decide the next chapter of this story. For nearly 2 years, Asia's loved ones had lived with unanswered questions. Now, they were about to hear whether justice would answer at least one of them. The prosecutor's voice was steady as the charges were read. Murder. The evidence was clear. The relentless calls to Asia's phone. The location data that followed her final steps. The DNA that tied Gerald Gurmel Richards to her body. And, above all, His own admission, the chilling explanation that he had felt tricked when he realized Asia was transgender. The defense tried to soften his actions, framing it as a moment of panic, a tragic but impulsive reaction. But for the jury, that argument didn't erase the deliberate choices he made. Richards had called her again and again. He had driven her to a secluded spot. He had pulled the trigger. Panic didn't explain preparation. Hate did. When the verdict was read guilty of murder, Asia's family broke. Tears fell freely, hands clutched together, the weight of relief mixing with the raw sting of grief. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring her back. No sentence, no number of years, could ever replace the laughter, the love, the presence they had lost. The sentencing phase came next. Richards was given 38 years in prison, a number that to some felt too light, but to others was at least a sign that his crime would not be erased. He would grow old behind bars. Asia would never grow old at all. Outside the courthouse, community members gathered with signs bearing her photo. Justice for Asia. Black trans lives matter. The news cameras captured the chants, but they couldn't capture the fullness of the moment. For those who knew her, the verdict was more than a headline. It was closure, fragile, imperfect, but real. Asia's mother spoke softly after the sentencing. She thanked the community for standing with them, for keeping her daughter's name alive. She said what so many parents of murdered children say: "I just want people to remember her as she was. Loving, giving, full of light." But Asia's case wasn't just a personal tragedy. It became a symbol. Her name was invoked in conversations about the epidemic of violence against Black transgender women. Advocates pointed to her story as proof of why society couldn't look away, why vigils alone weren't enough, why policy, protection, and cultural change had to follow. At vigils held in her honor, speakers told stories of her kindness, how she had shown up for others, even when she herself was struggling. They described her activism, her commitment to helping transgender youth find safety, her smile that could ease the weight of someone else's pain. To them, Asia wasn't just another name on a growing list. She was a force, and yet, the pain was still sharp. Justice, one advocate said, doesn't mean victory. It means accountability. It means the world lost someone it should have protected. The wider world might have moved on quickly. News cycles churned. Other tragedies took the spotlight. But in Houston, and in the hearts of those who loved her, Asia's story remained. Each November 20th, her name was spoken during the Transgender Day of Remembrance. Each year, her photo was held high at marches and rallies. In a sense, Richards's sentence closed one chapter. But another opened the question of what society would do with Asia's memory. Would her story be used to demand change, to protect others, to shift attitudes, or would it fade, another tragedy filed away? For Asia's family, the answer was clear. Her legacy would live on. They worked with advocates to tell her story, to keep her name from being forgotten. Her mother said, "She gave so much in her life. If people keep fighting in her name, then she's still giving. The fight is far from over." The numbers remain grim. Year after year, Black transgender women continue to face disproportionate violence. Many cases go unsolved. Some never even make the news. Asia's case, with its clear evidence and eventual conviction, was in many ways an exception. Too many others remain shrouded in silence. But exceptions matter. They set precedent. They prove that justice is possible. And they remind the world that behind every statistic is a human being with a story, a family, a laugh, a life. Asia Gina Foster's story is now one of those reminders. Her name will not vanish. Her smile will not be erased. Her fight, though cut short, continues in the voices of those who loved her, those who speak her name, and those who refuse to let her death be in vain. In the months after the trial, as the noise of the courtroom faded, a quieter truth remained. Asia Gina Foster's story didn't end with a verdict. It lived on in the lives she touched, in the activism she inspired, and in the way her name became a rallying cry for justice. At community gatherings across Houston, Asia's face appeared on murals, banners, and posters. Her photo, bright-eyed, warm, hopeful, was carried during marches for transgender rights. Speakers invoked her memory to remind the crowd that behind every policy debate, every statistic, was a human being who deserved safety, love, and life. Her mother often stood at these vigils, sometimes silent, sometimes speaking through tears. She said she wanted the world to remember her daughter not for the violence that ended her life, but for the love that defined it. Asia gave so much of herself, she would say. If we keep speaking her name, she's still giving. That sentiment echoed through the LGBTQ community. Asia had been known as someone who gave time and energy to help others, especially transgender youth in need. After her death, those she once mentored carried her lessons forward. Some began organizing support groups. Others stepped into activism more boldly, citing her example. Her spirit, they said, urged them not to give up, even in the face of fear. The broader movement took note, too. National organizations highlighted her case when calling for stronger protections for transgender individuals. Advocates pointed to the nearly 2-year delay before Richards's arrest as evidence of systemic failures. Why should a community already so vulnerable have to wait so long for justice? Why do so many cases remain unsolved? Asia's story became part of that larger conversation. A symbol of both what progress could look like and how much further society still had to go. Each year on November 20th, the Transgender Day of Remembrance, Asia's name is read aloud alongside dozens of others lost to violence. But for those who knew her, it's not just a ritual, it's a way of keeping her alive. They tell stories of her laugh, her kindness, her habit of showing up for others no matter what. They say her presence can still be felt in the rooms where she once comforted strangers. But there's also a haunting truth. Asia's story is not unique. Violence against transgender women, particularly Black transgender women, continues at alarming rates. Advocates say her death reflects a culture where prejudice, fear, and hate too often turn deadly. Her case, though it ended in conviction, is a reminder of how fragile justice can be and how many never receive it. The questions linger. How many more names will be added to the list? How many mothers will sit in courtrooms clutching photos of daughters gone too soon? How long before society not only remembers but protects? Asia's story forces us to confront those questions. It refuses to let us look away, and perhaps that is her legacy. Not only the love she gave, not only the justice won in her name, but the demand her life now makes of us, to do better, to care deeper, to fight harder. Her mother, at one vigil, put it simply, "My daughter believed in love. If you want to honor her, live that way. Love, even when it's hard, love, even when the world doesn't. So, Asia Gina Foster's story does not end with the sound of a gunshot on a cold November night in Houston. It continues in every chant at a march, in every candle lit in remembrance, in every act of kindness carried out in her name. Her life, though cut short, stretches beyond her years, reminding us that justice isn't just about one verdict, but about building a world where no more names have to be added to the list. Because the real question we're left with is this: will Asia be remembered only as another victim, or as a turning point? That answer lies not in the past, but in what we choose to do next. Picture it again. Houston, the 20th of November 2020. A day meant for remembrance. A night meant for honoring lives lost. Asia Gina Foster walks out of Grace Place, smiling, her heart full from helping others. She doesn't know it's the last time she'll be seen alive. A phone call pulls her away. A car door closes. Minutes later, silence. From that moment, her story split in two. On one side, the cruel violence that ended her life. On the other, the enduring legacy she left behind. And between those sides lies the question we can't escape. How do we, as a society, respond? For her family, the grief will never disappear. Her mother still sets a place for her at holidays, still hears her laughter in memory, still dreams of what her future might have been. Friends still scroll through old texts, still expect her name to light up their phones. The absence is sharp, endless. Justice brought accountability, but not healing. Nothing can return what was stolen. Yet, in another sense, Asia remains. Every time her name is spoken at vigils, every time her photo is lifted high at rallies, every time someone recalls her kindness, she is there. She is there in the young people she once mentored, who now mentor others. She is there in the chants of activists demanding justice for the next victim, and the next, and the next. Asia's life forces us to confront something uncomfortable. How dangerous it can be simply to exist as a transgender woman in America. The violence is not random. It's rooted in prejudice, in ignorance, in the belief that someone's identity can make them less worthy of love, of safety, of life. Richards's words in court revealed that truth plainly. He didn't see Asia's humanity. He saw a target, and that's what makes remembering her so vital. Because to speak her name, to tell her story, is to insist that her life mattered, that she was more than the circumstances of her death, that she was a daughter, a friend, an activist, a dreamer. The story of Asia's murder might have ended in a cold case, like so many others. But science, persistence, and community pressure kept it alive. And that persistence led to accountability. Richards will spend nearly 4 decades in prison. But the deeper challenge remains. How do we stop the next Asia from being taken? How do we make sure that her story is not just remembered, but used as fuel to build something safer, better, kinder? Asia's mother offered the clearest answer. My daughter believed in love. That's what I want people to remember. She believed in loving people, even when they didn't love her back. And maybe that's the legacy we're meant to carry. Love. In a world that often answers difference with hate, maybe the bravest response is to love harder, to love louder, to love as Asia did. Her death was cruel, but her life was beautiful. And in the end, beauty has a way of outlasting cruelty. So, as the candles burn each November, as her name is spoken, As her photo glows in the hands of marchers, Asia lives on. Not just in memory, but in action. In every young person who finds safety because of the movement she inspired. In every law debated because her story was told. In every heart softened by the reminder that love is stronger than hate. Asia's story began with a phone call and ended with silence. But we don't have to leave it there. We can decide what comes next. We can fill that silence with remembrance, with action, with love. The question is, will we?